Hi all, welcome, happy Monday, welcome to The Wife of Caesar. My name is Michele Bien, or Michele Bien, either's fine. As you know, The Wife of Caesar is Streiner's project to talk about corruption or anti-corruption with words that everybody can understand so that we can fight corruption in our day-to-day lives with a little bit more than just good intentions. As with every show, we will talk about a piece of news, a case, and a typology. Today's news deals with Lafargeholcim, a major company in construction and manufacture of concrete. Most of you might know of the company or of the two separate entities that used to exist, one Lafarge and the other Holcim, one French and the other Swiss. These were two major players in the industry of manufacturing construction materials, concrete, and all of that. They decided to merge, and now they are a huge company, one of the biggest companies in the world in this industry. Okay, what's going on with them? Well, in 2009, they decided to set up a manufacturing plant, a factory in the north of Syria. All well and good, except in 2010, the different social movements erupted in Syria, and these led to the war that now we know torn the country apart. The question here was most major companies that were in this position decided to simply remove their operations from Syria. And it makes sense because their investment is at risk and their people are at risk. So it makes more sense, or it actually saves money to simply remove your operation from a country that's torn by war and move them elsewhere. Might be expensive in the short term, but saves lives in the mid and long terms. Not Lafargeholcim. They decided, you know what, let's just stay here and see what happens. And what happened was that the Islamic State, ISIS, took over, which was not good for anyone. Now, the Islamic State, as most of you know, either killed and tortured everyone in Syria, or they extorted them for money, violence in exchange for money, or the refraining from killing them in exchange for money. So it's essentially extortion. And Lafargeholcim reportedly around 2014 made it public that they had reached unacceptable agreements with the Islamic State, which essentially means they were paying bribes to the Islamic State so that they would let them continue to operate in the north of Syria. Now, it might seem to you that in this case, Lafargeholcim, the company, is being the victim of the crime, but not exactly. It could be perceived that way, but the length of the period that they continue to pay the bribes signals something else. It signals impropriety. Now, if a terrorist organization threatens you with violence and death and torture unless you pay them money, what you do is you immediately pay the money, and as soon as possible, you get the hell out, right? You don't stick around for 8 years and continue operations risking the life of your personnel. But this is exactly what this company did, thinking this might just be the cost of doing business. Well, the cost of doing business in this case was a prosecution for crimes against humanity and terrorism funding. As you might know, crimes against humanity are those crimes that we find so repugnant, so repellent, that the entire international community, the United Nations, pretty much everyone has agreed they will never expire. They have no statute of limitations, and they can be tried everywhere. And some of them even admit life in prison or the death penalty. These are horrible, horrible crimes. Among these crimes are apartheid, terrorism, sexual slavery, torture, ethnic cleansing, things like that. These horrible, horrible acts. And the occupation of Syria by ISIS was one of those acts considered to be crimes against humanity. Now, this is unprecedented. In around 2018, charges were brought against Lafargeholcim, against the company, for participating in crimes against humanity. And crimes against humanity, these sort of crimes are mostly perpetrated by, the terrorist organizations, dictators, genocides, people like that, but almost never by companies, right? Organizations, yes, but companies that are in business and that trade in several stock markets, never, right? Well, not the case. Today, it was announced that the French authorities that were pursuing Lafargeholcim for crimes against humanity decided to drop the charges, but this hasn't been decided definitely, so we might hear about this sometime in the near future. However, this agency decided that even though they were dropping the charges for crimes against humanity, they would keep or maintain or continue to pursue the charges for funding of terrorism. And what you might be asking is funding of terrorism. Well, we have talked about money laundering, and by now you know that money laundering is taking dirty money and making it appear clean. Well, terrorism funding is the exact opposite. It operates in the same form, but it goes the exact opposite way. It means taking money that might come from reputable, clean sources, legitimate businesses, and channeling it to terrorism organizations. So taking clean money and using it for dirty purposes, dirty crimes, right? Okay, what happened here is that, or what's going on here is that Lafargeholcim, because they were paying bribes or these fees that the Islamic State was extorting from them for such a long time, they are deemed to be financing terrorism. Because again, you're gonna claim that you're being extorted for 8 years? Not really. So they might, the authorities, the French authorities, might find that the company in fact was knowingly and willingly financing terrorism or terrorism activity. Obviously, this prosecution still has to be carried out. Probably some more investigation and the entire process of a trial. But if the company is found guilty of terrorism financing, it might set a very interesting new precedent in international law because of the magnitude of the company, because of the extent of the terrorism acts, of the acts of terror perpetrated by ISIS, and because of the penalties that might ensue. Fantastic. Let's move on to the case. As you know, Transparency International is turning 25 this year, and they released a list of the 25 most iconic cases of corruption, and we are doing a rundown of that list. Today, we will talk about the Gupta family. The Gupta family actually refers to three brothers in South Africa, and the case was picked up because these three brothers, all businessmen, paid so many bribes and to such an extent that they effectively gained control of the government of South Africa in what Transparency International is now referring to as a modern coup. They were able to, buy their way into power. This happened during the term of President Zuma, now former President Zuma of South Africa, and essentially the Gupta brothers are believed to have absconded with around $7 billion worth of public funds. And they did this, again, by paying bribes to high officials. Essentially, everybody in the highest tiers of government, from the president to the ministers or secretaries of state, were receiving bribes from the Guptas. And they, one major example is they were the sole contractors or the sole beneficiaries of a supply contract with South Africa's rail and port company. So essentially, nobody else could function or provide services or goods to the Rail and Port Authority of South Africa, except for the Guptas. This contract was worth around $4 billion, so a huge, major contract. And you have to remember that even though the South African economy is huge, it's not that big. So that it's not that big that $7 billion would go unnoticed. The major issue here was that these three brothers spent so much money in bribes, were able to corrupt the highest tiers of government, and were able to effectively secure the highest form of power in South Africa. And they made a lot of money in the process. Now, this case is notorious not because of what they did, but because of how they did it, or to the extent that they did it. It is rumored that the Guptas allegedly once requested that the president fire one of the ministers of the government, which again is unprecedented, or at least not in public life. It's unheard of, right? Well, they wielded so much power that they felt fairly comfortable ordering the president of a country to fire a secretary of state. Now, today, the government has changed, and now the new president of South Africa is leading investigations, anti-corruption investigations into President Zuma and all of the ministries that were in his presidency. And that, of course, will lead to investigations against the Guptas. But because they still wield some power, they learned of these investigations and of the warrants against them, and they fled the country. And allegedly, nobody knows where they are. Obviously, these prosecutions will have to continue. The investigations will yield results, become trials, and then they still have to be defeated at trial. But again, the way the Guptas were flaunting the laws and wielding power was unprecedented, unheard of, and frankly, obscene. Fantastic. Let's move on to the typology. Today we will talk about terrorism funding. Now, you have heard us talk about money laundering, essentially the crime of taking dirty money and making it appear as clean. Well, terrorism funding works the exact opposite way. It has the same steps, but it works the opposite way. You take clean money from legitimate sources, and through several steps, you conceal it and you channel it to terrorist organizations. You might have heard of this company. Well, this is achieved in many ways. So there are so many ways to do terrorism funding and money laundering that the governments of the different countries, or the financial intelligence units of all of the governments, get together once a year in Paris, and they essentially exchange notes. They tell each other how people are laundering money and financing terrorism in their countries, so that everyone can know and catch up to criminals that are doing it in other countries. It's just a whole thing, and they get very creative. One of the ways in which terrorism has been funded, which was actually very interesting, pretty famous, was around between 2001 and 2011. A tourism company, a travel agency and tourism company that operated in several countries, including the US, was funneling money to Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. What happened here was, this was a company, again, doing business internationally. They were set up to do business in, among other countries, the US, and they actually sold tourist or travel packages to tourists that also included boat rides, or scenic boat rides. What they were doing is a little bit of money laundering and a little bit of terrorism financing. They might have had, say, 10 clients, but they claimed to have had 100. The other 90 came from illicit sources. The other 10 came from, regular, ordinary people that actually bought these travel packages, and they were taken around the world to do sightseeing and tourism. But the money was concealed through different shell companies, and the effective beneficiary, the person who actually controlled the money, was found to be Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. So this means that some people unknowingly participated in terrorism. And again, this is not the sort of thing that you can control. It might be the case that a legal, legitimate operation that one of us might do will eventually lead to the funding of terrorism, and there's really not much you can do. The only thing you can do is to follow a very strict know your customer, know your supplier policies, which essentially means if you're going to do business with someone, just try to make sure that you find out who the real people behind the operation are, behind the outfit are, and that nothing seems suspicious about them. If you know these people from a mutual acquaintance or whatever, you're probably safe. But if you have no idea with whom you're dealing, it always pays to check the news, or maybe if you're too meticulous, to check international blacklists, just to make sure that your money doesn't end up in the hands of terrorists. So this was it for today. Thank you for joining us. Again, as with every show, I will leave you with this. Every act of corruption should be denounced. Please blow the whistle, but do so safely. If you're not sure whether or not what you're looking at is corruption, or you're not sure that your personal safety is guaranteed, don't do anything. Refrain from acting. Reach out to people who might be able to help you. Feel free to reach out to us at info@streiner.mx, or log on to streiner.mx to find detailed instructions on how to blow the whistle anonymously and through the deep web. But above all, please stay safe. Again, this was The Wife of Caesar. My name is Michel Levien, or Michel Levien, either's fine, and have a happy Monday.